Okay, so you want to run the Persian Empire. Start in New York City, not Iran. Carved above the entrance of the James Farley Post Office on 8th Avenue is a sentence almost every American has walked past without reading closely. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. Most people assume that's about the U.S. mail. It isn't, not original. It's a translation of something the Greek historian Herodotus wrote around 430 BC, describing a relay system built by the kings of Persia roughly 2,500 years ago, a network so fast and so reliable that a message could cross 1,700 miles of desert, mountain, and river in about a week when walking the same distance took 3 months. The Postal Service borrowed the words because there was nothing better to say about a courier network, even one built by an empire that fell before the Roman Republic had even finished expanding across Italy. That road is the least surprising thing about how the Persians ran their empire, because underneath the famous stuff, the palaces, the armies, the doomed invasions of Greece, sits one of the most sophisticated administrative machines the ancient world ever built. And it has a genuinely strange economic personality at its core, one that's almost the mirror image of every other empire we could put in front of a camera. Most empires get rich and then spend themselves into trouble. This one got rich and then very deliberately stopped spending. It built the fastest information network on Earth and one of history's most famous gold coins, and then ran at the very same time one of the most effective wealth-freezing machines any state has ever operated. Stick around because the ending of the story is the part almost nobody tells you, and it involves a Macedonian king setting fire to 200 years of savings in a single afternoon. Let's build it from the ground up. The empire's founder, Cyrus the Great, didn't invent Persian coinage. He inherited it in 546 BC, the moment he conquered the kingdom of Lydia in western Anatolia and captured its legendarily wealthy king, Croesus. Lydia is where coinage itself had been invented a generation or two earlier, stamped lumps of electrum used to pay soldiers and settle debts with a reliability that loose bullion never had. Cyrus simply kept the machine running and kept expanding, adding Babylon in 539 BC. And by the time his son Cambyses added Egypt a few years later, the Persian kings controlled more farmland, more trade routes, and more taxable people than any state before them. None of that on its own is an economic system. It's a conquest. The actual economic architecture, the part that made this empire run for 2 centuries rather than collapsing after one dramatic decade like most conquest states did, came from the man who took the throne in 522 BC after a genuinely murky succession crisis, Darius I. Herodotus records a saying that apparently circulated among the Persians themselves, ranking the first 3 kings by temperament. Cyrus was remembered fondly as something like a father figure to his subjects. Cambyses was remembered as harsh and careless of his people, and Darius earned a less flattering nickname that translates roughly to the shopkeeper or the huckster, because he was, more than anything else, obsessed with getting paid. That reputation was well earned. Under Cyrus and Cambyses, provinces mostly sent the crown gifts, an informal and wildly inconsistent system where wealthy regions could get away with token contributions, and poorer regions could be squeezed arbitrarily by whichever local official showed up. Darius scrapped that. Around 519 BC, he carved the empire into a formal set of tax districts called satrapies, 20 of them according to the list Herodotus later recorded, and assigned each one a fixed annual tribute, paid mostly in silver, measured out and weighed to an exact standard, with a handful of provinces paying in kind instead, horses from Cilicia, grain from Egypt, and famously, gold dust rather than silver from the Indian satrapy at the empire's eastern edge. Modern historians who've gone back through Herodotus's numbers put the total somewhere in the range of 7,700 to 14,500 talents of silver a year, depending on which ancient unit of measurement you use to do the conversion, which in raw weight works out to well over 200 metric tons of silver flowing into the royal treasuries annually, on top of the separate gold shipments from India. This is, by a wide margin, the most systematic tax bureaucracy the world had seen up to that point, and it's the reason later empires, including eventually Rome, copied pieces of the Persian provincial model almost wholesale. Collecting that tribute reliably from a territory stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River required something Cyrus and Darius both understood instinctively. You cannot tax what you cannot reach. So they built a road, or more precisely, upgraded and connected a patchwork of older roads, mostly Assyrian in origin, into a single administrative spine called the Royal Road, running roughly 1,700 miles from the western city of Sardis, near the Aegean coast, to the eastern administrative capital at Susa. Along it sat somewhere around 110 relay stations, spaced almost exactly a day's ride apart, each one stocked with fresh horses and fresh riders. A message handed to the first courier in Sardis would be physically carried by a dozen or more different men and horses in relay. Never never resting, swapping the dispatch at each station the way a modern relay race swaps a baton, and arrive in Susa in 7 to 9 days flat. An ordinary traveler, covering the same ground on foot, needed closer to 3 months. That speed gap, roughly 10 to 1, is the entire reason a Persian king sitting in Persepolis or Susa could plausibly govern a rebellion in Anatolia or a tax dispute in Egypt without losing control of it in the months it would otherwise take news to arrive and orders to return. Now here's the part that surprises people who assume this whole empire ran on money the way we'd picture a modern economy running on money, because it mostly didn't, and understanding why is the key to the rest of this story. Darius did mint coins, and they're genuinely gorgeous objects. The gold coin was called the Daric, about 8.4 grams of nearly pure gold, stamped with an image of the Persian king kneeling with a bow, and it was pegged at a fixed exchange rate against a smaller silver coin called the siglos, 20 siglos to 1 Daric. These coins were minted almost exclusively at Sardis in the empire's far west, and they circulated mostly in exactly the region you'd expect. Asia Minor, the Aegean coast, the parts of the empire in direct contact with Greek city-states, where they were used above everything else to pay Greek mercenaries, who wouldn't accept payment in grain rations or in unminted bullion the way subjects deeper inside the empire routinely did. Move east into the Persian and Elamite heartland around Persepolis, and coined money becomes almost invisible in the record. The actual day-to-day economy there ran on something much older. Fixed rations of grain, wine, beer, and livestock issued to workers and officials on a fixed schedule according to rank, more or less a salary paid entirely in kind. We know this in extraordinary, almost embarrassing detail because of one of the great archaeological finds of the 20th century. In the 1930s, archaeologists excavating Persepolis uncovered more than 30,000 clay tablets stacked inside the fortification wall of the palace complex. Administrative records written mostly in the Elamite language, covering roughly a 15-year window during the reign of Darius I. Only around 2,000 of them have ever been fully published, painstakingly translated by the American scholar Richard Halleck starting in the 1930s and finally released in 1969, and they are staggering in their mundane specificity. They record exactly how much grain, wine, or beer a given work crew received in a given month, broken down by ethnicity, by sex, by skill level, and by whether a woman on the crew had recently given birth, in which case her ration scale went up. Workers called kurtash, a term covering everyone from unskilled laborers to trained craftsmen, show up by the thousands in these records. Egyptians, Babylonians, Lydians, Assyrians, all drawing standardized pay from the same central bureaucracy, all a very long way from home, all paid not in coin but in food. It's the closest thing the ancient world has left us to an actual payroll ledger, and it proves the Achaemenid economy ran less like a marketplace and more like a single, gigantic, centrally administered household. So follow the money, or rather the silver, because that's really what it was. Tribute flows in from 20 satrapies, weighed and recorded, mostly as raw silver bullion rather than coin. A slice of it gets reissued as darics and sigloi to pay soldiers and mercenaries in the West. A slice of it becomes grain and wine rations for the administrative workforce running the palaces. And then a very large remaining slice does something that should sound familiar if you've ever tried to save money instead of spending it. It goes into storage. The royal treasuries at Persepolis, at Susa, and at Ecbatana in Media accumulated silver and gold, year after year, reign after reign, not as working capital circulating through an economy, but as a static hoard, melted into ingots and locked behind palace walls. This wasn't an accident or a failure of financial sophistication. Modern numismatists who've traced the metal itself using lead isotope analysis on surviving coins have identified what they call the Persian mix, a chemically distinct pool of silver bullion built up from tribute sources across the Aegean, Macedonia, and Thrace over roughly 200 years, sitting essentially motionless in Achaemenid vaults while the world outside kept minting, spending, and trading with whatever silver it had left over. Estimates of the total scale of that accumulated hoard, by the time the dynasty ended, run to something in the neighborhood of 5,000 metric tons of silver equivalent, gold included, converted at the ancient exchange rate. That is a genuinely difficult number to picture. So try this instead. It is very plausibly the single largest concentration of precious metal any state anywhere had assembled up to that point in human history, and almost none of it was doing anything except sitting there. Why would a state that clearly understood taxation, logistics, and payroll well enough to run detailed ration ledgers for foreign laborers also choose to freeze a 5,000-ton fortune instead of putting it to work? Partly, it's ideology. Persian kingship framed the treasury as a physical symbol of the king's power and the empire's permanence, something to be displayed and guarded rather rather than spent. Much the way a modern central bank holds gold reserves it has no intention of ever selling. Partly it's structural. Coined money was still, in the 5th century BC, a relatively new and regionally limited technology, useful for paying Greek soldiers who wouldn't take anything else, but not yet the universal medium the Achaemenid core needed for its grain and livestock ration economy. And partly, frankly, it's the safest possible fiscal policy for a king who has just watched his predecessor die in a succession crisis. An enormous standing reserve of untouched bullion is the ancient equivalent of a sovereign wealth fund you never draw down, insurance against every emergency at once. Whatever the mix of reasons, the practical result is the same. For roughly 200 years, the Achaemenid Empire ran what amounts to the largest and longest sustained savings program in the ancient world, quietly pulling silver out of circulation across the entire eastern Mediterranean and Near East, one annual tribute payment at a time. That strategy held up beautifully right up until it met a 21-year-old Macedonian king with an army to pay and absolutely no interest in saving. By the time Alexander crossed into Asia in 334 BC, the Achaemenid Empire he was invading had been running this hoarding machine for roughly 2 centuries, through wars against the Greek city-states that Persia mostly lost, through a series of succession disputes and provincial revolts that mostly didn't threaten the core, and through the slow drift of an aging bureaucracy that Greek writers, admittedly not neutral witnesses, increasingly described as corrupt and out of touch with its own frontier garrisons. None of that structural decay mattered much to Alexander's actual campaign, which turned on battlefield victories rather than economic collapse. What it meant, though, was that when Alexander finally did break through at Issus in 333 BC and decisively at Gaugamela in 331 BC, he wasn't just capturing territory, he was capturing 200 years of uncashed saving, all in one place. The numbers, even accounting for the fact that ancient historians loved a big round figure and modern historians argue constantly about the exact conversions, are staggering by any standard. At Susa, the Greek biographer Plutarch reports that Alexander's men found 40,000 talents of already minted coin sitting in the palace treasury, alongside a still larger fortune in unminted bullion and luxury goods. At Persepolis a few months later, the historian Diodorus Siculus describes soldiers hauling out gold and silver, representing, in his account, the accumulated revenue of every Persian king going back to Cyrus himself, a hoard modern scholars have tried to convert into a weight of silver and consistently land somewhere in the range of 2,000 to 5,000 metric tons from that single city. Add Ecbatana, add smaller regional treasuries, and reasonable modern estimates for the combined haul across Alexander's whole Persian campaign run from around 120,000 talents up toward 200,000, figures that vary this much precisely because no two ancient sources agree and no modern historian claims certainty, but that land, however you slice it, on the same conclusion. This was, without serious competition, the largest single seizure of precious metal in the history of the ancient world. And then Alexander did the one thing 200 years of Achaemenid fiscal policy had specifically avoided doing. He spent it immediately, and on an almost unimaginable scale. Soldiers got enormous bonus payments, some individual troops reportedly receiving payouts worth years of ordinary wages in a single distribution. New mints across the conquered territory started striking Alexander's own coinage. Much of it literally melted down from captured Persian darics and ingots, the same Persian mixed silver that lead isotope studies can still trace today, sitting inside coins struck under Alexander and, after his death, under the rival successor kings who carved up his empire. Persepolis itself, the ceremonial heart of the whole hoarding system, went up in flames during a drunken celebration in 330 BC, whether as calculated revenge for the Persian burning of Athens a century and a half earlier, or as impulsive chaos historians still debate. And either way, it meant the physical vault that had symbolized 2 centuries of accumulated Achaemenid wealth was gone for good, its contents already on their way into circulation. What follows is one of the clearest natural experiments in ancient monetary history, even if the ancient sources don't hand us a clean modern-style statistic to quote. Dump the equivalent 5,000 tons of silver, effectively frozen out of the ancient Mediterranean economy for 2 centuries, back into active circulation inside a single decade, and you get exactly what a modern economist would predict: a monetary shock. Coinage exploded across the Hellenistic world in the years after Alexander's death. Historians of ancient coinage have documented a genuine surge in minting volume traceable directly to Persian-sourced bullion, and price levels in parts of the Greek world climbed noticeably in the same period, though scholars are understandably cautious about pinning an exact inflation figure on evidence this old and this patchy. The broad shape of it, though, isn't really in dispute. The empire that spent 2 centuries systematically removing silver from the ancient economy handed that same silver back all at once through the body of the army that destroyed it, and the ancient Mediterranean spent a generation generation absorbing the shock. So here's the final accounting, and it's a genuinely unusual one on this channel, because it isn't a story about an empire that overspent itself into ruin, or one that got looted by its own creditors, or one that lost its founding purpose and kept the wealth anyway. It's the opposite failure mode entirely. The Achaemenid Persians built, by any fair measure, one of the best administered tax systems, road networks, and payroll bureaucracies the ancient world ever produced, detailed enough that we can still read exactly how much beer a female weaver in Persepolis received the month she had a baby. And then, having built all that sophistication, they took the single largest fortune any state had ever assembled, and did essentially nothing with it for 200 years, beyond guarding it, admiring it, and occasionally minting a small slice of it to pay soldiers in the one corner of the empire that insisted on being paid in coin. It sat there as pure potential, the ancient equivalent of a fortune stuffed under a mattress instead of invested, right up until a 25-year-old with an army and zero patience for savings accounts walked in, set the mattress on fire, and spent 200 years of Persian restraint in roughly a decade. The empire that built the fastest information network on Earth never quite figured out that money, unlike a message on the royal road, only does its job when it's actually allowed to move.